The Voynich Manuscript stands as one of the most baffling and haunting artifacts ever discovered, a book that seems to exist at the edge of human understanding, inviting curiosity while resisting every attempt to decode its secrets. Believed to have been created sometime in the early 15th century, this strange manuscript is filled with pages of flowing, elegant script written in a language that no one has been able to identify, alongside illustrations that appear both scientific and surreal at the same time. The drawings show unfamiliar plants that do not match any known species, intricate circular diagrams that resemble astronomical charts, and mysterious human figures interacting with bizarre structures and liquid-like systems, as if depicting a reality that follows rules different from our own. For centuries, scholars, historians, and cryptographers have tried to unlock its meaning, approaching it from every possible angle: linguistic analysis, pattern recognition, historical comparison, yet each effort seems to lead back to the same silent barrier, as though the manuscript is carefully constructed to appear meaningful while revealing nothing concrete at all. Its text flows with a consistency that suggests structure rather than randomness, repeating patterns and symbols in ways that resemble real language, which has led many experts to believe that it must contain genuine information, not just meaningless scribbles. At the same time, however, no known cipher system, code-breaking technique, or linguistic framework has successfully translated even a single sentence with certainty, creating a paradox that only deepens its mystery. It looks like language, behaves like language, but refuses to become language in any way we understand. Some theories suggest that it could be a lost or constructed language, created by a mind operating outside the boundaries of conventional communication, while others argue that it might be an elaborate hoax designed to deceive and fascinate, perhaps even created to mimic the appearance of knowledge without containing any real meaning. There are also those who speculate that it encodes hidden scientific or philosophical insights, locked away behind layers of encryption that have yet to be broken, waiting for a future mind or technology capable of seeing what others could not. The manuscript's discovery adds another layer of intrigue, having surfaced in the possession of rare book dealer Wilfred Voynich in 1912, from whom it takes its modern name, though its origins trace back much further, possibly passing through the hands of scholars and collectors who themselves could not decipher it. Even today, advanced computer algorithms and artificial intelligence systems have been applied to its text, searching for patterns or hidden structures that might reveal its underlying logic, yet the results remain inconclusive, often raising more questions than answers. What makes the Voynich manuscript so compelling is not just its resistance to interpretation, but the way it challenges our assumptions about language, meaning, and knowledge itself, forcing us to confront the possibility that something can appear perfectly structured and intentional while remaining completely inaccessible to understanding. It sits in a strange space between order and chaos, clarity and obscurity, as if it were designed to exist precisely in that tension, never fully revealing itself, never fully collapsing into nonsense. Each page turn feels like stepping deeper into a puzzle that has no clear entry point and no visible solution, a quiet reminder that not everything that exists can be easily explained or categorized. And so, the manuscript endures, not just as an unsolved mystery, but as a symbol of the limits of human comprehension, a silent presence that continues to provoke questions without offering answers, drawing us in not because we are certain we will understand it, but because we cannot resist trying. As researchers continued to study the Voynich manuscript, a strange realization began to take shape, one that made the mystery even deeper rather than clearer. The manuscript does not behave like random noise, yet it refuses to behave like any known language either, existing in a space that feels intentionally balanced between order and incomprehensibility. Linguists examining the text have observed that the distribution of symbols follows patterns similar to natural languages, including repetition, structure, and even something resembling grammar, which strongly suggests that the text was not created randomly or carelessly. Certain symbols appear more frequently than others, forming clusters and sequences that look like words and sentences, and these sequences repeat across different sections of the manuscript in ways that feel systematic rather than accidental. However, despite these patterns, Every attempt to map the symbols to known alphabets or phonetic systems has failed, as if the manuscript is designed to imitate the surface features of language without revealing any deeper connection to meaning. This has led to an unsettling possibility, that the manuscript might represent a kind of illusion of language, something that looks readable, feels structured, and invites interpretation, but ultimately resists every effort to extract concrete information from it. Cryptographers have spent decades applying classical and modern decoding techniques to the text, from frequency analysis to complex computational models, yet none have succeeded in producing a translation that holds up under scrutiny. Even when partial patterns seem promising, they quickly break down, revealing inconsistencies that cannot be resolved within any known linguistic framework. The illustrations only add to this ambiguity, as they appear detailed and purposeful, yet they do not correspond clearly to any identifiable system of knowledge. The plants, for example, are drawn with careful attention to detail, as if they are meant to represent real species, yet no botanist has been able to match them to anything in the natural world. Similarly, the astronomical diagrams suggest an understanding of celestial patterns, but they do not align perfectly with known historical models of the cosmos. This combination of familiarity and strangeness creates a powerful cognitive tension, making the viewer feel as though meaning is just out of reach, always close enough to almost grasp, but never quite accessible. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript could be written in a highly sophisticated cipher, possibly involving multiple layers of encryption or a completely unique encoding system that has not yet been discovered. Others have suggested that it might represent a lost language, perhaps from a culture or individual that did not leave any other records behind, making it impossible to cross-reference or decode. There is also the controversial theory that the manuscript might be a carefully constructed hoax, designed to mimic the statistical properties of real language without actually conveying any meaning, a kind of intellectual illusion meant to intrigue and deceive. Yet this idea raises its own questions, as creating such a convincing imitation would require an extraordinary level of skill and understanding, especially given the time period in which the manuscript is believed to have been created. Adding to the complexity is the historical trail of the manuscript, which includes references to scholars and collectors who encountered it long before modern attempts at decoding began, suggesting that its mystery has persisted across generations, untouched by the passage of time. The fact that even today, with advanced computational tools and artificial intelligence, the text remains undeciphered only reinforces its enigmatic nature, as if it exists just beyond the reach of current human capability. What makes the Voynich Manuscript so uniquely compelling is not just its resistance to interpretation, but the way it continuously challenges the very concept of understanding itself, forcing us to question whether meaning is always something that can be discovered, or whether it can sometimes be constructed in a way that intentionally avoids being understood. It invites us to consider the possibility that language, as we know it, may not be the only way to encode or experience information, and that there may be forms of communication that exist outside the frameworks we are familiar with. In this sense, the manuscript becomes more than just an unsolved puzzle. It becomes a mirror reflecting the limits of our own perception, showing us how easily we can be drawn into patterns and structures that seem meaningful, even when they ultimately lead nowhere. And so, as the investigation continues, the Voynich Manuscript remains suspended in a state of unresolved tension, a document that appears to speak, yet says nothing, a text that invites reading, yet refuses to be read, leaving us caught between the desire to understand and the growing realization that understanding may not be possible at all. As the effort to decode the Voynich Manuscript continued into the modern era, it began to attract not only historians and linguists but also some of the most skilled codebreakers in the world, individuals who had successfully unraveled complex ciphers during times of war and secrecy, yet even they found themselves confronted with something fundamentally different, something that did not behave like a typical encrypted message waiting to be unlocked. During the 20th century, cryptographers who had previously worked on breaking military codes turned their attention to the manuscript, approaching it with the confidence that any human-made cipher could eventually be solved with enough effort and analysis, but what they encountered instead was a system that seemed to resist not just specific techniques, but the very assumptions those techniques were based on. In most encrypted texts, there is an underlying language that can be recovered once the code is broken, a hidden layer of meaning that reveals itself through patterns and substitutions, but in the case of the Voynich Manuscript, no such layer has been conclusively identified, leaving researchers uncertain whether they are dealing with a cipher at all. Some have suggested that the text might be generated through a method that produces language-like patterns without actually encoding meaningful content, a possibility that challenges the traditional goal of cryptography, which is to reveal hidden information rather than question whether any information exists in the first place. This has led to experiments attempting to recreate the manuscript's statistical properties, with researchers generating artificial texts that mimic its structure, yet even these attempts fall short of capturing the full complexity and consistency observed in the original document. At the same time, advances in computational analysis have allowed scientists to examine the manuscript in unprecedented detail, using algorithms to detect subtle patterns, correlations, and anomalies that might not be visible to the human eye. But while these methods have uncovered intriguing regularities, they have not provided a clear path to translation, often reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates according to rules that do not align with known linguistic systems. The illustrations continue to complicate the picture, as they appear to be organized into thematic sections, including botanical, astronomical, and possibly biological or medical content, suggesting that the manuscript was intended to convey knowledge of some kind, yet the inability to interpret the accompanying text prevents any definitive understanding of what that knowledge might be. This disconnect between visual clarity and textual obscurity creates a unique form of frustration, as if the manuscript is offering pieces of a puzzle without revealing how they fit together, encouraging interpretation while simultaneously undermining it. Some researchers have proposed that the key to understanding the manuscript may lie not in the text alone, but in the relationship between text and image, suggesting that the illustrations might provide contextual clues that could help decode the language, but so far, no approach has successfully bridged that gap. Others have explored the possibility that the manuscript represents a form of knowledge that is inherently difficult to translate, perhaps because it is based on concepts or experiences that do not map easily onto modern frameworks of thought, raising the question of whether the barrier to understanding lies in the manuscript itself or in the limitations of our own interpretive tools. The historical context of the manuscript adds another layer of complexity, as it emerges from a period rich with scientific curiosity, mystical traditions, and experimental approaches to knowledge, a time when the boundaries between science, art, and philosophy were far less rigid than they are today, making it possible that the manuscript reflects a worldview that does not fit neatly into any single category. This ambiguity has fueled a wide range of theories, from the idea that it is a sophisticated scientific treatise encoded for secrecy, to the possibility that it is a personal project, perhaps even an attempt to create a new form of language or symbolic system, one that was never intended to be widely understood. The involvement of modern technology, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, has brought renewed hope that patterns hidden within the text might eventually be uncovered, yet these tools also highlight the limitations of purely data-driven approaches, as they rely on comparisons to known systems and patterns, which may not apply if the manuscript operates on fundamentally different principles. What becomes increasingly clear is that the challenge posed by the Voynich manuscript is not simply a technical problem to be solved, but a deeper question about the nature of language, meaning, and interpretation, one that forces us to confront the possibility that not all systems of communication are designed to be decoded in the ways we expect. In this sense, the manuscript serves as a boundary marker, a point at which our current methods and assumptions begin to break down, revealing the edges of our understanding and inviting us to consider new ways of thinking about information and knowledge. Whether it is ultimately deciphered or remains forever mysterious, its true significance may lie not in the answers it contains, but in the questions it As the mystery of the Voynich manuscript deepens, a more unsettling possibility begins to emerge, one that shifts the focus away from simply decoding the text and toward questioning the very nature of what the manuscript represents. For centuries, the assumption guiding most investigations has been that the manuscript contains hidden knowledge waiting to be uncovered, that beneath its strange symbols and unfamiliar illustrations lies a coherent system of meaning that can eventually be revealed through the right method or insight. However, as repeated attempts to decode it continue to fail, some researchers have begun to consider a different perspective, one in which the manuscript may not be a container of concealed information at all, but rather an artifact that challenges the boundary between knowledge and illusion. The text itself appears structured, following patterns that resemble real language, yet it consistently resists translation, creating a paradox in which it looks meaningful without ever becoming meaningfully understood. This has led to the idea that the manuscript might be intentionally constructed to simulate the appearance of knowledge, a kind of elaborate linguistic mirage that invites interpretation while providing no stable ground for it. Such a possibility raises profound questions about the relationship between form and meaning, suggesting that it may be possible to create something that feels like it should contain information without actually containing it in any conventional sense. The illustrations further complicate this interpretation, as they appear detailed and purposeful, depicting plants, celestial diagrams, and human figures engaged in activities that seem to follow an internal logic, yet they do not correspond clearly to any known scientific or cultural framework. This combination of apparent structure and persistent ambiguity creates a powerful cognitive effect, drawing the observer into a continuous cycle of interpretation and doubt, where each new hypothesis seems plausible at first but ultimately fails to provide a complete explanation. Some scholars have suggested that the manuscript might reflect a form of knowledge that is inherently symbolic or experiential rather than literal, meaning that its true significance cannot be captured through direct translation but must be approached in a different way, perhaps through pattern recognition, visual interpretation, or even intuitive understanding. Others argue that this line of thinking risks projecting meaning onto something that may not contain it, highlighting the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine insight and the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. The historical context in which the manuscript was created adds another layer of intrigue, as the early 15th century was a time of intellectual exploration, where scientific inquiry, artistic expression, and mystical thought often intersected, making it possible that the manuscript was produced within a cultural environment that valued complexity and ambiguity as much as clarity and precision. The figure of Wilfrid Voynich, who rediscovered the manuscript in the early 20th century, serves as a reminder that its modern identity is shaped not only by its content but also by the narratives that have formed around it, as each generation of researchers brings new assumptions, methods, and expectations to the task of understanding it. With the advent of modern technology, including advanced computational analysis and artificial intelligence, there was renewed hope that the manuscript secrets might finally be uncovered, yet these tools have so far reinforced the same fundamental tension, revealing patterns without providing clear meaning, and highlighting the gap between structure and interpretation. This ongoing uncertainty has led some to propose that the true significance of the Voynich manuscript may not lie in a hidden message waiting to be decoded, but in its ability to challenge our understanding of what a message is, forcing us to confront the possibility that meaning is not always an inherent property of a text, but something that emerges through interaction between the text and the reader. In this sense, the manuscript becomes a kind of intellectual mirror, reflecting the processes by which we seek to understand the world, and exposing the assumptions that guide those processes. It invites us to question whether our desire for clarity and explanation might sometimes lead us to impose structure where none exists, and whether the boundary between knowledge and illusion is more fluid than we might like to believe. As the investigation continues, the Voynich manuscript remains suspended in this ambiguous space, neither fully understood nor completely dismissed, a document that seems to exist precisely at the point where certainty gives way to uncertainty, and where the search for answers becomes inseparable from the recognition of our own limitations. In this way, it stands not only as a historical artifact, but as a continuing challenge to the way we think about language, knowledge, and the nature of understanding itself. As the study of the Voynich Manuscript moves deeper into uncertainty, the question subtly shifts from "what does it mean?" to something far more complex: what does it mean to seek meaning at all? For generations, researchers have approached the manuscript with the assumption that every structured system must ultimately resolve into interpretation, that patterns, repetition, and organization are signs pointing toward an underlying message waiting to be uncovered. Yet the Voynich Manuscript resists this assumption in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if it stands at the very edge of interpretation, allowing the mind to approach but never fully enter. Its symbols repeat, its sequences flow, its visual sections suggest coherence, and yet every attempt to stabilize these elements into a consistent framework breaks apart under scrutiny, leaving behind only fragments of possibility rather than conclusions. This persistent instability creates a unique psychological experience for those who study it, a sense of being continuously drawn forward by the promise of understanding, only to find that the ground beneath that promise never solidifies. It is not simply that the manuscript is difficult to decode, but that it challenges the very expectation that decoding should be possible, raising the unsettling possibility that meaning, as we define it, may not be present in a form that can be extracted. Some scholars have begun to consider whether the manuscript might represent a system that operates according to principles fundamentally different from known language, perhaps one that encodes relationships, processes, or patterns of thought rather than direct statements or descriptions. In such a case, the failure to translate it would not indicate the absence of meaning, but rather the mismatch between the system it uses and the systems we use to interpret it. This idea opens the door to a more abstract understanding of the manuscript, one in which it is not a text to be read in the traditional sense, but a structure to be experienced, a network of symbols that may only reveal its significance through forms of perception that go beyond linear decoding. At the same time, this perspective raises important questions about the limits of interpretation itself, as it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine insight and imaginative projection. The human mind is naturally inclined to find patterns, to construct narratives, and to impose order on ambiguity, and the Voynich Manuscript provides an almost perfect canvas for this tendency, offering just enough structure to suggest meaning without ever confirming it. This creates a delicate balance, where each new theory feels plausible within its own framework, yet fails to achieve universal acceptance, leaving the manuscript suspended in a state of perpetual interpretation without resolution. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its creation in the early 15th century to its rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich and its continued examination in the modern era, adds to this sense of continuity without conclusion, as it has passed through different contexts, cultures, and methodologies without yielding its secrets. Even with the application of advanced computational tools, which can analyze vast amounts of data and detect subtle statistical patterns, the core mystery remains unchanged, suggesting that the challenge may not lie in the complexity of the manuscript alone, but in the assumptions we bring to its study. What if the manuscript is not hiding meaning in the way we expect, but instead revealing the boundaries of our interpretive frameworks? What if its true significance lies not in what it says, but in what it prevents us from saying with certainty? In this light, the Voynich Manuscript becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a philosophical object, one that forces us to confront the limits of language, knowledge, and understanding. It stands at the edge where interpretation begins to lose its grip, where the desire to know encounters something that does not yield to that desire, not through resistance, but through absence of alignment with our expectations. And yet, this very resistance is what continues to draw attention. As the manuscript embodies a paradox that is difficult to ignore, it appears meaningful enough to invite endless study, yet remains elusive enough to defy every conclusion. In this way, it transforms the act of interpretation into an ongoing process rather than a final achievement, a continuous engagement with uncertainty that challenges not only what we know, but how we know it. As researchers continue to explore its pages, the The Voynich Manuscript remains poised at this threshold, neither fully open nor completely closed, a silent presence that invites us to look, to question, and to reflect, while quietly reminding us that not all mysteries are meant to be resolved in the way we expect. As inquiry into the Voynich Manuscript continues, the focus gradually shifts from the object itself to the processes through which it is examined, revealing a subtle but profound transformation. The manuscript begins to function less as a text to be decoded and more as a mirror reflecting the mechanisms of interpretation. For centuries, each generation of researchers has approached it with the tools and assumptions of its time: philological analysis, cryptographic techniques, statistical modeling, and now machine learning, yet the outcome remains remarkably consistent, not in the form of answers, but in the form of recurring uncertainty. This persistence suggests that the difficulty may not lie solely in the complexity of the manuscript, but in the interaction between its structure and the interpretive frameworks applied to it. The symbols appear ordered, the distributions consistent, the sections thematically grouped, and yet these qualities do not converge into a stable, translatable system, as if the manuscript occupies a space where structure is present without being reducible to conventional meaning. This creates a unique feedback loop in which the more rigorously one attempts to interpret it, the more apparent the limitations of those interpretive methods become. Researchers often begin with confidence, identifying patterns that seem promising, mapping symbol frequencies, proposing grammatical rules, or correlating illustrations with possible semantic domains, but as these hypotheses are tested, inconsistencies emerge, forcing revisions, reinterpretations, and eventually abandonment. The cycle then repeats, with new approaches generating new possibilities that ultimately encounter the same boundary. In this way, the manuscript does not simply resist interpretation, it actively exposes the assumptions underlying it, revealing how meaning is constructed, inferred, and sometimes projected. The involvement of figures like Wilfred Voynich in bringing the manuscript to modern attention underscores the role of historical context in shaping interpretation, as the narrative surrounding the document, its discovery, its age, its mysterious provenance, inevitably influences how it is perceived and studied. The illustrations, which might be expected to provide grounding or context, instead deepen the ambiguity, as they appear coherent within themselves yet fail to anchor the text to any known system of knowledge. This disconnect invites a reconsideration of the relationship between visual and textual information, suggesting that the manuscript may not conform to the expectations we impose on such relationships. Some researchers have proposed that the text could be generated through algorithmic or procedural methods that produce language-like patterns without encoding specific meanings, a hypothesis that aligns with the statistical regularities observed but challenges the assumption that structured text must correspond to communicative intent. Others maintain that meaning is present but encoded in a way that requires a fundamentally different mode of interpretation, perhaps one that has not yet been developed or recognized. Both perspectives highlight the central tension, whether the manuscript is an unsolved problem within existing frameworks or an indication that those frameworks themselves are incomplete. The application of modern computational techniques has intensified this tension, as algorithms can identify patterns at scales beyond human perception, yet they still depend on predefined models of language and structure, which may not apply if the manuscript operates outside those models. As a result, the data generated by these analyses often reinforces the sense of structure without yielding clear interpretation, creating a situation where evidence accumulates without resolution. This ongoing process transforms the manuscript into a kind of experimental space, where theories about language, cognition, and meaning can be tested against a resistant and ambiguous object. It raises questions about the nature of understanding itself. Is understanding the extraction of meaning from an external source, or is it the alignment between the structure of that source and the interpretive capacities of the observer? If the latter, then the Voynich manuscript may represent a case where such alignment is absent or incomplete, resulting in a persistent gap that cannot be bridged through conventional means. In this sense, the manuscript does not simply withhold its meaning, it reveals the conditions under which meaning becomes accessible, and by extension, the conditions under which it does not. As the investigation continues, the manuscript remains unchanged, its pages as enigmatic as ever, while the interpretations surrounding it evolve, reflecting shifts in methodology, technology, and perspective. This dynamic underscores its role not just as a historical artifact, but as an ongoing challenge to the way we approach unknown systems, reminding us that the pursuit of understanding is shaped as much by our own frameworks as by the objects we seek to understand. As the investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues to evolve, a subtle but profound shift begins to take place, one that moves beyond the question of what the manuscript contains and toward the realization that the act of interpretation itself may be reaching its limits. For centuries, scholars have approached the manuscript with the expectation that meaning, once sufficiently analyzed, must eventually reveal itself, yet the repeated failure of even the most advanced methods suggests that the obstacle may not simply be complexity, but something more fundamental. The text appears structured, its symbols arranged with consistency and repetition, its sections organized in ways that resemble coherent systems, yet every attempt to stabilize these features into a unified interpretation encounters a kind of conceptual resistance, as if the manuscript allows patterns to emerge only to dissolve them before they can fully form into meaning. This creates an experience in which interpretation begins to fold back on itself, where each layer of analysis reveals not clarity, but the limitations of the analytical process. Linguistic models attempt to map the symbols onto known grammatical systems, only to find that the patterns do not align. Cryptographic approaches search for underlying codes, only to discover that there is no stable key. Computational analyses detect statistical regularities, yet these regularities do not translate into semantic content. The result is not simply failure, but a recursive process in which the tools of interpretation continuously expose their own boundaries. The historical presence of figures like Wilfred Voynich, who brought the manuscript into modern awareness, reminds us that each era engages with the text through its own intellectual lens, and that these lenses shape not only the methods used, but also the expectations brought to the task. The illustrations, often seen as potential anchors for meaning, instead contribute to the sense of dislocation, as they appear internally coherent yet externally ungrounded, resisting straightforward classification and interpretation. Some researchers have begun to explore the possibility that the manuscript operates according to principles that do not correspond to conventional language at all, suggesting that it may encode relationships, patterns, or processes in a way that is not intended to be translated into linear text. Others consider the idea that it may be a form of constructed artifact, designed to simulate the appearance of meaningful structure without containing a fixed semantic core, effectively creating a system that invites interpretation while remaining inherently indeterminate. Both possibilities challenge the assumption that interpretation is a process that inevitably leads to resolution, raising the question of whether there are systems that are structurally complete yet semantically open, or even intentionally resistant to closure. The application of artificial intelligence and machine learning has intensified this inquiry, as these tools can process vast amounts of data and identify patterns beyond human capacity, yet they still rely on models derived from known languages and structures, which may not apply in this case. As a result, the outputs of these systems often reinforce the presence of structure without providing a pathway to meaning, creating a situation in which analysis becomes increasingly sophisticated while understanding remains elusive. This tension highlights a deeper issue, the possibility that interpretation is not a universal process, but one that depends on alignment between the system being interpreted and the framework used to interpret it. If such alignment is absent, then interpretation may not simply fail, it may become self-referential, turning inward and revealing the assumptions and limitations of the interpreter rather than the nature of the object. In this sense, the Voynich manuscript functions as a kind of conceptual boundary, a point at which the tools of understanding begin to lose their effectiveness, not because they are flawed, but because they are being applied to something that operates outside their domain. This does not necessarily imply that the manuscript is meaningless, but rather that its meaning, if it exists, may not be accessible through the methods currently available. As scholars continue to engage with it, the process itself becomes a subject of reflection, prompting questions about how meaning is constructed, how patterns are recognized, and how knowledge is defined. The manuscript remains unchanged, its pages as enigmatic as ever, yet the discourse surrounding it grows increasingly complex, reflecting a shift from solving a problem to understanding the nature of the problem itself. In this ongoing engagement, the boundary between object and interpretation becomes less distinct, and the manuscript begins to reveal not only its own mystery, but the deeper structures of inquiry that we bring to it, inviting us to reconsider what it means to understand something that may not be designed to be understood in the ways we expect. As the long investigation into the Voynich Manuscript continues, a quiet inversion begins to take place, one that shifts attention away from the manuscript as an object to be decoded and toward the very act of searching itself, transforming the mystery into something that is no longer confined to the pages of the book but extends into the processes, assumptions, and expectations of those who study it. Over time, the accumulation of failed interpretations, partial patterns, and competing theories has created a landscape in which the question is no longer simply, what does the manuscript say, but, what are we doing when we try to make it say something, a shift that reframes the entire endeavor. Each attempt to decode the text introduces a new framework, linguistic, cryptographic, statistical, or computational, and each framework reveals certain regularities while obscuring others, creating the impression that the manuscript adapts to the lens through which it is viewed, offering just enough structure to sustain inquiry without ever yielding a definitive interpretation. This dynamic suggests that the search for meaning may be interacting with the manuscript in a way that produces the very patterns it seeks to uncover, not in the sense that the patterns are imagined, but in the sense that their significance is shaped by the interpretive context in which they are identified. The historical narrative surrounding the manuscript, including its rediscovery by Wilfred Voynich, reinforces this perspective, as the identity and significance of the document have evolved alongside the methods used to study it, reflecting broader shifts in intellectual culture and technological capability. The illustrations, often treated as potential keys to understanding, contribute to this recursive process, as their apparent coherence invites interpretation while their lack of clear correspondence to known systems prevents any single interpretation from stabilizing, creating a feedback loop in which visual and textual elements continuously inform and destabilize each other. Some researchers have begun to consider whether the manuscript might function as a kind of open system, one that does not encode a fixed message but instead generates interpretive possibilities depending on the framework applied, effectively turning the act of reading into a form of participation rather than extraction. This idea challenges the traditional notion of a text as a container of meaning, suggesting instead that meaning may emerge through interaction, and that in the absence of a shared framework between text and reader, that emergence may remain incomplete or indeterminate. At the same time, this perspective raises critical questions about the boundary between discovery and projection, as it becomes increasingly difficult to determine whether a given interpretation reveals something inherent in the manuscript or something introduced by the interpreter. The application of advanced computational tools, including machine learning algorithms trained on large corpora of known languages, has further complicated this issue, as these systems can detect patterns and generate hypotheses at scales beyond human capacity, yet they still rely on models that assume certain properties of language and meaning, which may not hold in this case. As a result, the outputs of these systems often reflect the structure of the models themselves as much as the structure of the manuscript, reinforcing the idea that the search process is inseparable from the results it produces. This realization leads to a deeper philosophical question: if meaning is not simply found but constructed through interaction, then what does it mean to say that a text has meaning independent of interpretation? The Voynich Manuscript, by resisting stable interpretation, brings this question into sharp focus, revealing the extent to which our understanding of language depends on shared conventions, contextual knowledge, and mutual intelligibility. Without these elements, even a highly structured system can remain opaque, not because it lacks meaning, but because the conditions required to access that meaning are not present. In this sense, The manuscript becomes a boundary object, marking the limits of communicative alignment and highlighting the role of interpretation as an active, context-dependent process. As scholars continue to engage with it, the focus increasingly shifts from solving the manuscript to understanding the nature of the search itself, examining how different methodologies shape perception, how assumptions guide analysis, and how the desire for resolution influences interpretation. The manuscript remains unchanged, its symbols and images fixed on the page, yet the discourse surrounding it continues to evolve, reflecting a growing awareness that the mystery may not lie solely in the text, but in the interaction between text and interpreter. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript serves not only as an unsolved puzzle, but as a catalyst for rethinking the foundations of meaning, interpretation, and knowledge, inviting us to consider that the search for understanding may reveal as much about ourselves as it does about the object we seek to understand. As the exploration of the Voynich Manuscript moves further into conceptual depth, a striking pattern begins to emerge, not within the manuscript itself, but within the process of engaging with it. Meaning repeatedly appears on the verge of forming, only to dissolve before it can stabilize, creating a persistent state of interpretive suspension. Each analytical approach, whether grounded in linguistics, cryptography, or computational modeling, uncovers structures that suggest coherence, repeating glyph clusters, positional regularities, section-based organization, yet these structures resist integration into a unified explanatory framework, as if the manuscript permits the emergence of local patterns while preventing their consolidation into global meaning. This phenomenon produces a distinctive cognitive experience, one in which the mind continuously oscillates between recognition and uncertainty, perceiving fragments of order without achieving closure. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its creation in the early 15th century to its rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich and its subsequent examination across generations, reinforces this dynamic, as each era brings new interpretive tools and expectations, only to encounter the same fundamental indeterminacy. The illustrations, often treated as anchors for interpretation, contribute to this instability by presenting visually coherent scenes, botanical forms, astronomical diagrams, and human figures, while simultaneously resisting precise identification or contextualization, thereby preventing them from serving as definitive guides to the text. This interplay between apparent structure and persistent ambiguity suggests that the manuscript operates at a threshold where meaning can be suggested but not fixed, inviting interpretation without allowing it to settle. Some researchers have proposed that this behavior may result from a system that encodes relationships or constraints rather than explicit propositions, meaning that the text structure reflects an internal logic that does not map directly onto conventional semantic categories. Others have explored the possibility that the manuscript was generated through a process that produces language-like distributions without encoding stable referential content, effectively creating a system that mirrors the statistical properties of language while remaining semantically open. Both perspectives converge on a central insight. The manuscript challenges the assumption that structure necessarily entails interpretable meaning, revealing a gap between formal organization and semantic accessibility. The application of machine learning and large-scale pattern analysis has intensified this insight, as these methods can identify correlations and regularities with high precision, yet they still fail to produce a consistent translation or interpretation, suggesting that the limiting factor may not be the detection of patterns, but the mapping of those patterns onto meaningful frameworks. This raises a deeper question about the nature of meaning itself. Is meaning an intrinsic property of a structured system, or does it arise only when that system is situated within a shared context of interpretation? In the case of the Voynich manuscript, the absence of such a context, no known language family, no parallel texts, no confirmed reference, creates a situation in which even well-defined structures remain semantically indeterminate. The manuscript thus becomes a case study in the conditions required for meaning to stabilize, highlighting the roles of convention, reference, and interpretive agreement. At the same time, it exposes the tendency of the human mind to project coherence onto ambiguous stimuli, a tendency that can generate compelling but ultimately unverified interpretations. This tension between discovery and projection is not easily resolved, as the same patterns that invite interpretation also support multiple, often conflicting, explanatory models. As a result, the manuscript resists not only a single solution, but the very notion of a final solution, maintaining a state in which meaning is continuously approached but never fully realized. In this context, the focus of inquiry begins to shift once again, from the content of the manuscript to the dynamics of interpretation, examining how different methodologies interact with the text, how assumptions shape outcomes, and how the desire for resolution influences the perception of evidence. The manuscript remains unchanged, its symbols fixed and its images static, yet the interpretive landscape surrounding it continues to evolve, reflecting ongoing efforts to reconcile structure with meaning. Ultimately, the Voynich Manuscript stands as a persistent reminder that the presence of order does not guarantee the presence of accessible meaning, and that the boundary between the two may be more complex than commonly assumed. It invites a reconsideration of how meaning is recognized, how it is constructed, and under what conditions it can be said to exist at all, leaving us in a space where understanding is not absent, but perpetually incomplete, always forming, never settling. As the journey through the enigma of the Voynich Manuscript reaches a deeper level of reflection, the mystery no longer appears as a distant puzzle waiting to be solved, but as something that exists precisely at the threshold of understanding, where knowledge and uncertainty meet without ever fully merging. After generations of analysis, speculation, and technological advancement, the manuscript remains unchanged in its silence, yet the way it is perceived has transformed significantly, revealing not only the limits of interpretation but also the nature of the interpretive process itself. What becomes increasingly clear is that the manuscript does not simply resist decoding in a conventional sense, it disrupts the very expectation that decoding will lead to clarity, creating a situation in which every step toward understanding simultaneously reveals new layers of ambiguity. Its symbols maintain their structured appearance, repeating with a consistency that suggests deliberate construction, while its illustrations continue to evoke familiarity without allowing precise identification, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates within a system that is coherent yet inaccessible. The historical presence of figures such as Wilfrid Voynich, who brought the manuscript into modern awareness, reminds us that the meaning of the document is inseparable from the contexts through which it has been encountered, as each era projects its own frameworks, technologies, and expectations onto the text, shaping not only how it is studied but how it is imagined. In the modern age, the application of artificial intelligence and computational linguistics has introduced new possibilities, allowing researchers to analyze the manuscript at scales and levels of detail previously unimaginable. Yet these tools have also underscored a fundamental limitation. They can identify patterns, but they cannot guarantee meaning, especially when the underlying system may not correspond to any known model of language. This realization has led to a gradual shift in perspective, from viewing the manuscript as a problem to be solved toward understanding it as a boundary object, one that marks the limits of current knowledge and invites the development of new ways of thinking. The question is no longer simply whether the manuscript can be decoded, but what it reveals about the conditions under which decoding is possible, and how those conditions shape our conception of meaning itself. Some scholars have begun to consider that the manuscript may not contain a fixed message in the traditional sense, but rather a form of structured ambiguity, a system that generates the appearance of meaning without resolving into a single interpretation, thereby sustaining an ongoing process of inquiry. Others maintain that a solution may still exist, hidden within layers of complexity that have yet to be fully understood, suggesting that the current impasse reflects not the absence of meaning, but the limitations of existing methods. These perspectives are not necessarily contradictory. Instead, they highlight different aspects of the same phenomenon, emphasizing the interplay between structure, interpretation, and expectation. The Voynich manuscript thus becomes more than an isolated mystery. It becomes a lens through which broader questions about language, cognition, and knowledge can be examined, prompting us to reconsider what it means to understand something, and whether understanding must always take the form of definitive explanation. In this light, the manuscript occupies a unique position, not as a problem awaiting resolution, but as an enduring point of tension between what can be known and what remains beyond reach, encouraging a form of inquiry that is open-ended rather than conclusive. It challenges the assumption that every structured system must yield to interpretation, suggesting instead that there may be forms of organization that do not align with our current models of meaning, and that encountering such forms can expand the boundaries of thought itself. As the investigation continues, the manuscript remains a silent presence, unchanged in its form yet constantly reshaped by the perspectives brought to it, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of understanding is not always about arriving at answers, but about engaging with the unknown in a way that deepens our awareness of both its complexity and our own limitations. As the exploration of the Voynich Manuscript continues beyond the threshold of conventional understanding, a deeper transformation begins to take shape, not within the manuscript itself, but within the frameworks used to approach it, revealing a gradual shift from seeking answers to re-evaluating the very structures of inquiry. For centuries, the dominant assumption has been that meaning is something embedded within a text, waiting to be uncovered through analysis, translation, or decryption, yet the persistent resistance of the Voynich manuscript to all such efforts suggests that this assumption may not always hold. The manuscript presents a system that appears ordered, consistent, and intentional, yet it does not align with any known linguistic, cryptographic, or symbolic framework, creating a situation in which the tools designed to extract meaning instead highlight their own limitations. This has led to a growing recognition that the challenge posed by the manuscript may not be solvable within existing paradigms, and that a shift in perspective may be required, one that moves beyond the expectation of direct translation and toward a broader understanding of how meaning can be structured and perceived. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, including its rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, illustrates how its interpretation has always been shaped by the intellectual context of the time, as each generation brings new methods, technologies, and assumptions to the task, only to encounter the same underlying ambiguity. This continuity of uncertainty suggests that the manuscript operates at a level that is not easily captured by any single framework, requiring instead a more flexible and integrative approach that can accommodate multiple possibilities without forcing them into premature resolution. The illustrations, which continue to evoke both familiarity and strangeness, play a crucial role in this dynamic, as they provide visual anchors that suggest meaning while simultaneously resisting precise identification, thereby reinforcing the sense that the manuscript exists within a system that is coherent yet not directly accessible. In response to this challenge, some researchers have begun to explore alternative models of interpretation, drawing from fields such as cognitive science, semiotics, and complexity theory, in an effort to understand how meaning might emerge from systems that do not conform to traditional linguistic structures. These approaches emphasize the role of the observer in constructing meaning, suggesting that interpretation is not merely a process of extraction, but an interaction between the structure of the text and the cognitive frameworks of the reader. From this perspective, the failure to decode the manuscript may reflect not the absence of meaning, but a mismatch between the system it represents and the systems we use to interpret it, highlighting the importance of alignment in the process of understanding. At the same time, this line of inquiry raises important questions about the nature of that alignment, and whether it is always possible to achieve, especially when dealing with artifacts that may originate from contexts or conceptual frameworks that are no longer accessible. The application of advanced computational tools has further illuminated this issue, as these systems can identify patterns and regularities with remarkable precision, yet they remain dependent on models derived from known languages and structures, which may not apply in this case, resulting in analyses that are detailed but inconclusive. This has led to a growing awareness that the search for meaning may need to incorporate not only new techniques, but new ways of thinking about what meaning is and how it can be recognized. The Voynich manuscript thus becomes a catalyst for methodological innovation, encouraging researchers to question their assumptions, expand their frameworks, and consider the possibility that understanding may take forms that are not immediately recognizable as such. It challenges the notion that knowledge must always be explicit, suggesting instead that there may be systems in which meaning is distributed, implicit, or context-dependent, requiring a different mode of engagement to be fully appreciated. As the investigation continues, the manuscript remains unchanged, its symbols and images fixed in their enigmatic arrangement, yet the discourse surrounding it evolves, reflecting a shift from seeking definitive answers to embracing a more open-ended exploration of possibilities. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript serves not only as an unsolved mystery, but as a transformative object, one that reshapes the way we think about language, interpretation, and the boundaries of knowledge, inviting us to engage with the unknown not as a problem to be solved, but as a space in which new forms of understanding can emerge. As the inquiry into the Voynich Manuscript moves beyond conventional limits, a profound transformation begins to unfold, not in the manuscript itself, but in the way understanding is approached, revealing that the true impact of the mystery may lie not in what is uncovered, but in how the search reshapes the very idea of knowing. Over time, the repeated inability to decode the manuscript using established methods has begun to erode the assumption that all structured systems must ultimately yield to interpretation, opening the possibility that meaning may exist in forms that do not align with familiar linguistic or symbolic frameworks. This shift in perspective encourages a deeper reflection on the nature of understanding itself, suggesting that it may not always involve translating something unknown into something known, but rather expanding the boundaries of what can be recognized as meaningful. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its creation in the early 15th century to its rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, illustrates how its interpretation has been shaped by changing intellectual contexts, each bringing new tools and expectations, yet consistently encountering the same fundamental ambiguity. This continuity suggests that the manuscript operates at a level that transcends specific methodologies, functioning as a persistent challenge to the frameworks through which meaning is constructed. The illustrations, with their blend of familiarity and strangeness, continue to play a crucial role in this dynamic, offering visual forms that seem to invite recognition while resisting precise identification, thereby reinforcing the sense that the manuscript exists within a system that is coherent yet not directly accessible through conventional means. In response to this challenge, researchers have begun to explore more integrative approaches, drawing from disciplines such as cognitive science, semiotics, and systems theory, in an effort to understand how meaning might emerge from complex, nonlinear structures. These approaches emphasize the interactive nature of interpretation, suggesting that meaning is not simply embedded within a text, but arises through the relationship between the text and the observer, shaped by context, expectation, and cognitive framework. From this perspective, the difficulty of interpreting the Voynich manuscript may reflect not a lack of meaning, but a lack of alignment between the system it represents and the systems we use to interpret it, highlighting the importance of developing new modes of engagement that can bridge this gap. The application of advanced computational techniques has further underscored this point, as these tools can identify intricate patterns and regularities within the text, yet they remain limited by the assumptions built into their models, which are based on known languages and structures, resulting in analyses that reveal complexity without providing clarity. This has led to a growing recognition that the search for meaning may require not only new tools, but new conceptual frameworks, ones that can accommodate ambiguity, multiplicity, and the possibility of meaning that does not resolve into a single, definitive interpretation. The Voynich manuscript thus becomes a catalyst for rethinking the nature of knowledge, encouraging a move away from rigid definitions and toward a more flexible understanding that can embrace uncertainty as a productive element of inquiry. It challenges the idea that understanding must always culminate in clear answers, suggesting instead that it can also take the form of expanded awareness, deeper questioning, and the recognition of previously unseen possibilities. In this sense, the manuscript serves as a bridge between the known and the unknown, not by revealing a hidden message, but by transforming the way we engage with mystery itself. As the investigation continues, the manuscript remains unchanged, its symbols and images fixed in their enigmatic arrangement, yet the perspectives brought to it continue to evolve, reflecting a shift from seeking closure to embracing open-ended exploration. This transformation highlights the role of the unknown as a driving force in the development of knowledge, reminding us that the boundaries of understanding are not fixed, but continually reshaped through the act of inquiry. In engaging with the Voynich Manuscript, we are not only attempting to decode a text, but participating in a broader process of redefining what it means to understand, to interpret, and to know, a process that extends beyond the manuscript itself and into the foundations of human thought. As the long study of the Voynich Manuscript continues to unfold, the sense of mystery no longer feels like a fixed problem waiting at the end of a solution, but rather like a shifting horizon that moves further away each time it is approached, transforming the very act of investigation into a continuous journey rather than a path toward resolution. The manuscript, with its flowing yet undeciphered script and its intricate illustrations of plants, stars, and human figures, maintains an unusual balance between structure and ambiguity, as if it is carefully constructed to suggest meaning without ever allowing that meaning to fully solidify. Over time, this quality has forced researchers to reconsider their expectations about what it means for a text to contain information, since every attempt to anchor the manuscript in a stable interpretation seems to generate new uncertainties rather than resolve existing ones. The historical path of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the early 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects not only the persistence of its mystery but also the changing nature of the tools and ideas brought to it, each era projecting its own conceptual frameworks onto the same unchanging object. Despite the evolution of methodologies, from traditional philology to modern computational linguistics, the manuscript continues to resist assimilation into any known system of language or symbolic representation, suggesting that its resistance is not merely technical, but conceptual in nature. The illustrations, often examined as potential keys to understanding the text, add another layer of complexity, as they appear to be internally consistent yet externally unreferenced, depicting forms that resemble botanical, astronomical, or biological structures without corresponding clearly to any known classification. This creates a persistent tension between recognition and uncertainty, where the mind perceives order but cannot confirm its meaning, leading to a state in which interpretation is continuously initiated but never completed. In response to this challenge, some researchers have begun to explore the idea that the manuscript may not function as a conventional text at all, but rather as a system of relational patterns, where meaning is distributed across structures rather than encoded in discrete units of language. From this perspective, the manuscript would not be something to be translated in the traditional sense, but something to be understood as a dynamic configuration, where significance emerges through interaction rather than extraction. This approach shifts the focus away from decoding toward modeling relationships, suggesting that the failure to translate the manuscript may reflect a mismatch between linear interpretive methods and a system that operates in a fundamentally different way. At the same time, this shift raises important questions about the nature of interpretation itself, particularly the extent to which meaning depends on pre-existing frameworks of understanding. If meaning arises only when a system can be mapped onto familiar structures, then anything that falls outside those structures may remain perpetually inaccessible, not because it lacks meaning, but because it does not conform to the conditions required for recognition. The application of modern computational tools has intensified this realization, as algorithms can detect statistical regularities and structural patterns within the manuscript with remarkable precision, yet they remain unable to bridge the gap between pattern and interpretation, producing outputs that are rich in structure but poor in semantic resolution. This reinforces the idea that the challenge is not merely one of complexity, but of compatibility between systems of representation and systems of interpretation. As a result, the Voynich manuscript increasingly appears not as a single problem to be solved, but as a multi-layered phenomenon that engages linguistic, cognitive, and philosophical dimensions simultaneously. It invites reflection on how meaning is constructed, how patterns are recognized, and how knowledge is organized, suggesting that the boundaries between these processes may be more fluid than traditionally assumed. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its pages fixed and its symbols constant, yet its interpretive landscape continues to expand, shaped by each new attempt to understand it. In this way, it functions less as a static artifact and more as an active catalyst for inquiry, continually redirecting attention from answers to questions, from conclusions to possibilities. As the search for meaning continues, the manuscript stands at the center of an evolving dialogue between certainty and uncertainty, reminding us that understanding may not always be a destination, but an ongoing process shaped as much by what we cannot explain as by what we can. As the investigation into the Voynich Manuscript continues to deepen, a subtle but persistent realization begins to shape the way researchers approach it. The manuscript does not merely hide meaning, nor does it simply resist interpretation, but instead presents a condition in which patterns exist without stabilizing into answers, as if structure itself has been separated from resolution. The text continues to display consistent statistical behavior, with recurring symbols, balanced distributions, and repetitive sequences that strongly resemble linguistic organization, yet every attempt to map these features onto known language systems results in fragmentation rather than clarity. This paradox has led scholars to reconsider the assumption that pattern and meaning are inherently connected, suggesting instead that the relationship between them may depend on additional conditions that are not present in this case. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its unknown origin in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects a continuous projection of human interpretive frameworks onto an object that does not appear to conform to any of them, highlighting how each era reshapes the mystery according to its own intellectual tools. In earlier periods, the manuscript was approached with curiosity and speculation grounded in mystical or symbolic thinking, while later centuries introduced more systematic methods, including cryptography and linguistic analysis, and the modern era has added computational modeling and artificial intelligence to the effort, yet none of these approaches have succeeded in producing a stable translation. The illustrations, which have long been considered potential anchors for interpretation, continue to resist definitive classification, as they resemble botanical, astronomical, and anatomical forms without clearly corresponding to any known system of reference, creating a visual language that feels both structured and ungrounded at the same time. This duality reinforces the central tension of the manuscript. It appears to be organized according to internal rules, yet those rules do not translate into externally recognizable meaning. As a result, researchers are increasingly confronted with the possibility that the manuscript may not function as a traditional communicative system, but rather as a structured arrangement of elements whose purpose is not to convey a fixed message but to generate a field of interpretive possibility. In this view, meaning is not something embedded within the text waiting to be extracted, but something that emerges conditionally, depending on the relationship between the observer and the observed system. This shift in perspective challenges long-standing assumptions in linguistics and cryptography, both of which generally rely on the principle that structured signals correspond to recoverable information, suggesting instead that there may exist systems in which structure and meaning are not directly aligned. The use of modern computational techniques has further complicated this issue, as machine learning models can detect increasingly subtle regularities within the manuscript, yet these regularities do not converge into a coherent semantic interpretation, instead producing layers of statistical coherence without semantic closure. This reinforces the idea that the manuscript operates at a boundary where formal structure is present but interpretive mapping remains unstable, creating a situation in which analysis can be endlessly refined without approaching final understanding. Some researchers have proposed that this may indicate a fundamentally different mode of encoding, one that organizes relationships or constraints rather than explicit content, while others suggest that the manuscript may represent a deliberate construction designed to simulate the appearance of language without anchoring it to meaning. Both perspectives, however, converge on a shared observation. the manuscript disrupts the expectation that structured systems must ultimately yield to interpretation. This disruption has broader implications for how knowledge itself is understood, as it suggests that interpretation is not a neutral process of extraction, but an active construction shaped by the compatibility between system and framework. If such compatibility is absent or incomplete, then meaning may remain perpetually suspended, not because it is hidden, but because it cannot be fully realized within the available interpretive space. The Voynich Manuscript thus becomes more than an isolated enigma. It functions as a conceptual boundary, revealing the limits of current methodologies while simultaneously inviting the development of new ones. It challenges the assumption that understanding is a linear progression from confusion to clarity, suggesting instead that some systems may resist this progression altogether, maintaining a state in which meaning is continuously approached but never fully resolved. As the manuscript continues to be studied, it remains unchanged in form, yet its significance evolves with each new attempt at interpretation, reflecting not only the persistence of mystery but also the evolving nature of human inquiry itself, where the search for answers increasingly becomes an exploration of the conditions under which answers might exist at all. As the exploration of the Voynich Manuscript continues to unfold across generations of study, a quiet but profound transformation begins to emerge in the way the manuscript is perceived, shifting the focus away from the expectation of eventual decipherment and toward a deeper examination of the act of interpretation itself, as though the manuscript is no longer simply an object to be understood but a condition that exposes how understanding is constructed. The text, with its flowing yet undeciphered script, maintains a remarkable consistency that resembles natural language, exhibiting repetition, variation, and structural balance, yet these features never consolidate into a stable or translatable meaning, creating a persistent gap between appearance and comprehension. Over time, this gap has become increasingly significant, not because it can be closed, but because it continues to redefine the boundaries of what researchers consider knowable. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects a continuous layering of interpretive frameworks, each era projecting its own intellectual assumptions onto the text while encountering the same unresolved ambiguity. Early interpretations often leaned toward mystical or symbolic explanations, while later approaches adopted more systematic methodologies grounded in cryptography, linguistics, and statistical analysis, and contemporary efforts now incorporate computational models and artificial intelligence. Yet despite this progression in analytical sophistication, the core mystery remains unchanged. This persistence suggests that the manuscript may not be resistant to interpretation in a simple sense, but rather positioned at a level where interpretation itself becomes unstable, unable to settle into a definitive outcome. The illustrations, which depict botanical forms, celestial arrangements, and human figures engaged in unfamiliar activities, continue to play a central role in this dynamic, as they offer visual coherence without providing concrete referential anchors, thereby reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates within a self-contained system of meaning that does not correspond directly to known external frameworks. This creates a unique interpretive tension in which the observer recognizes patterns and structure but cannot confirm their significance, resulting in a continuous oscillation between recognition and uncertainty. In response to this challenge, some researchers have begun to consider the possibility that the manuscript does not encode meaning in a linear or symbolic manner, but instead organizes relationships, constraints, or procedural patterns that are not intended to be translated into conventional linguistic form. From this perspective, the manuscript would not function as a message to be decoded, but as a system to be engaged with, where meaning emerges through interaction rather than extraction. This shift in perspective challenges long-standing assumptions about the nature of texts and communication, particularly the idea that structured information necessarily corresponds to recoverable semantic content. At the same time, it raises important questions about the limits of interpretation, especially when the frameworks used to analyze a system may not be compatible with the system's underlying structure. The application of computational analysis has intensified this issue, as algorithms are capable of identifying intricate statistical regularities within the manuscript, yet these regularities do not converge into a coherent translation, suggesting that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to bridge the gap between structure and meaning. This has led to a growing awareness that the challenge posed by the manuscript may not be purely technical, but conceptual, requiring a re-evaluation of how meaning is defined and how it is accessed. The Voynich Manuscript thus begins to function not only as an unsolved artifact, but as a reflective surface that reveals the assumptions embedded within interpretive practices, showing how expectations about language, structure, and meaning shape the outcomes of analysis. In this sense, the manuscript becomes a site where interpretation turns inward, examining not only the object of study but also the cognitive and methodological processes that attempt to understand it. As this reflection deepens, the distinction between the manuscript and its interpretation becomes less distinct, as each attempt to understand it simultaneously reveals something about the nature of understanding itself. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its pages fixed and its symbols unaltered, yet its significance continues to evolve through the ongoing dialogue between structure and interpretation. In this evolving landscape, the Voynich Manuscript stands as a persistent reminder that the pursuit of meaning is not always a movement toward resolution, but sometimes a process of encountering the limits of interpretation, where understanding does not arrive as a conclusion, but as an ongoing awareness of the complexity of what it means to know anything at all. As the investigation into the Voynich Manuscript continues to extend across disciplines and generations, a subtle but profound realization begins to take hold. The manuscript seems to preserve structure with extraordinary consistency, yet that structure no longer appears to serve the conventional function of carrying accessible meaning, as if form has become independent from interpretation. The text continues to display characteristics typically associated with natural language, including patterned repetition, balanced distribution of symbols, and apparent syntactic regularity, but these features resist all attempts to stabilize them into a coherent semantic system. Over time, this persistent resistance has shifted the focus of inquiry away from the expectation of eventual translation and toward the deeper question of why such structured resistance exists at all. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects a continuous layering of interpretive attempts, each shaped by the intellectual tools and assumptions of its era, yet all converging on the same unresolved condition: the presence of order without accessible meaning. Early approaches often interpreted the manuscript through symbolic, mystical, or esoteric frameworks, assuming that its strangeness concealed hidden knowledge encoded in allegorical form, while later methodologies introduced more systematic approaches grounded in cryptography and linguistic theory, seeking to identify underlying substitution systems or lost languages. In the contemporary era, computational analysis and artificial intelligence have added unprecedented analytical power, enabling researchers to detect statistical regularities at multiple levels of structure, yet even these methods have not produced a stable or universally accepted interpretation, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates outside the boundaries of known linguistic systems. The illustrations, which include detailed depictions of plants, celestial diagrams, and human figures interacting with complex structures, continue to present a parallel challenge, as they appear internally coherent yet externally unanchored, resisting clear identification with any established system of knowledge. This dual presence of visual and textual structure creates a unique interpretive environment in which coherence is constantly suggested but never confirmed, leading to a sustained tension between recognition and uncertainty. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript may not encode meaning in the traditional sense at all, but instead represent a system in which relationships between elements are structured without being directly translatable into semantic content, suggesting a form of organization that prioritizes pattern over reference. From this perspective, the manuscript would not function as a message waiting to be decoded, but as a self-contained system whose significance emerges only through interaction rather than extraction. This idea challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics and information theory, both of which generally presume that structured signals correspond to recoverable meaning, and that decoding is a matter of identifying the correct mapping between system and interpretation. The Voynich Manuscript complicates this assumption by presenting a case in which structural regularity exists without yielding a stable interpretive endpoint, suggesting that structure and meaning may not always be directly linked. This has led to increasing interest in the possibility that meaning itself is not an inherent property of structured systems, but a relational phenomenon that depends on alignment between the system being interpreted and the framework of interpretation applied to it. In cases where such alignment is absent, structure may remain visible but semantically inert, producing a condition in which analysis reveals complexity without resolution. Computational approaches have highlighted this condition further, as machine learning models trained on large linguistic datasets are able to identify correlations and generate hypotheses, yet these outputs remain constrained by their dependence on known language structures, limiting their ability to fully engage with the manuscript's apparent divergence from those structures. As a result, the manuscript continues to function as a boundary case, revealing the limits of current interpretive frameworks while resisting assimilation into any single explanatory model. This ongoing resistance has gradually transformed the manuscript into more than an unsolved problem. It has become a conceptual reference point for discussions about the nature of meaning, structure, and interpretation, illustrating how systems can maintain coherence without yielding semantic clarity. In this way, the Voynich Manuscript challenges the assumption that understanding is always the endpoint of analysis, suggesting instead that some systems may sustain a form of organized ambiguity that does not resolve into definitive interpretation. As research continues, the manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and images fixed across its pages, yet its interpretive significance continues to evolve, shaped by the frameworks applied to it and the questions it provokes. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that structure alone does not guarantee meaning, and that the relationship between form and interpretation may be far more complex, and more uncertain, than traditionally assumed. As the long and intricate investigation into the Voynich Manuscript continues to evolve, a subtle yet profound shift begins to emerge in the nature of the inquiry itself, where the manuscript is no longer experienced solely as an external object of study, but increasingly as something that alters the perspective of those who study it, reshaping their assumptions about language, meaning, and interpretation. The text, with its consistent yet undeciphered script, continues to present an appearance of structure that closely resembles natural language, exhibiting patterns of repetition, variation, and distribution that suggest intentional organization, yet these same patterns resist any stable mapping onto known linguistic or symbolic systems. This persistent resistance has gradually transformed the manuscript from a problem of decoding into a deeper question about the relationship between observer and observed, as each attempt to interpret it reveals not only information about the manuscript itself but also about the limitations and tendencies of the interpretive frameworks being applied. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this evolving relationship, as each generation of scholars brings new methodologies and expectations to the text, only to encounter the same unresolved tension between apparent structure and inaccessible meaning. Early interpretations often leaned heavily on symbolic and mystical readings, assuming that the manuscript concealed esoteric knowledge encoded in allegorical form, while later approaches adopted more systematic techniques grounded in cryptography, linguistics, and statistical analysis, seeking to uncover hidden substitution systems or lost languages beneath the surface of the text. In the contemporary era, computational models and artificial intelligence have added unprecedented analytical depth, enabling the detection of complex statistical regularities and structural patterns. Yet even these advanced methods have failed to produce a coherent or universally accepted translation, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript does not conform to conventional models of language processing. The illustrations, which depict a wide range of botanical, astronomical, and human forms, continue to play a central role in shaping interpretation as they offer visually detailed yet ambiguously defined imagery that appears meaningful without anchoring itself to any identifiable system of reference. This combination of textual structure and visual ambiguity creates a unique interpretive environment in which meaning is continuously suggested but never stabilized, producing a sustained tension between recognition and uncertainty that resists resolution. As researchers engage more deeply with this condition, a growing number of perspectives suggest that the manuscript may not function as a traditional communicative artifact at all, but rather as a system in which meaning is distributed across relationships and patterns rather than encoded in discrete semantic units. From this viewpoint, the manuscript would not be something to be decoded in the conventional sense, but something to be engaged with as a dynamic structure, where significance emerges through interaction rather than extraction. This reorientation challenges long-standing assumptions in linguistics and information theory, particularly the idea that structured signals inherently correspond to recoverable meaning, and instead proposes that structure and meaning may operate on different levels of organization that are not always directly aligned. The application of computational analysis has further reinforced this possibility, as algorithmic models can identify intricate patterns and regularities within the manuscript, yet these findings do not converge into a stable interpretive framework, suggesting that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to bridge the gap between form and meaning. As a result, the manuscript increasingly functions as a boundary case, revealing the limits of current interpretive methodologies while simultaneously exposing the assumptions embedded within them. This has led to a broader philosophical reflection on the nature of understanding itself, raising questions about whether meaning is an inherent property of structured systems or a relational phenomenon that depends on compatibility between system and interpreter. In the absence of such compatibility, structure may remain visible but semantically inaccessible, creating a condition in which analysis can reveal complexity without producing clarity. In this sense, the Voynich Manuscript does not simply resist interpretation, it actively participates in reshaping the conditions under which interpretation occurs, turning the process of study into a reflective exercise in which the observer becomes increasingly aware of their own conceptual limits. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across its pages, yet its significance continues to evolve through the shifting frameworks applied to it, illustrating how meaning is not solely contained within an object but emerges through the interaction between object and perception. Ultimately, it stands as a persistent reminder that the act of understanding is not merely about uncovering what is hidden, but also about recognizing the boundaries of the systems we use to interpret the unknown, and in doing so, it transforms the pursuit of knowledge into an ongoing exploration of both external mystery and internal limitation. As the study of the Voynich manuscript continues to deepen, a subtle transformation begins to appear in the way the manuscript is experienced, where meaning no longer feels like something hidden beneath the surface waiting to be uncovered, but instead begins to behave like something unstable, constantly shifting depending on the angle of interpretation applied to it. The text, with its flowing and consistent yet completely undeciphered script, continues to present strong structural patterns that resemble natural language, including repetition of symbols, rhythmic clustering, and apparent organizational rules, yet every attempt to anchor these features into a stable translation results in fragmentation rather than resolution. This recurring failure has gradually changed the nature of the investigation itself, as researchers begin to recognize that the manuscript does not simply resist interpretation in a passive sense, but actively destabilizes the interpretive frameworks applied to it, causing meaning to drift rather than settle. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its uncertain creation in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this shifting relationship between object and interpretation, as each era approaches the text with new methods and assumptions, only to encounter the same underlying ambiguity that refuses to resolve into clarity. Early scholars often interpreted the manuscript through symbolic or mystical frameworks, assuming that its strangeness concealed hidden knowledge encoded in allegorical or esoteric form. while later researchers adopted more systematic approaches grounded in cryptography, linguistics, and statistical analysis, attempting to identify substitution patterns, structural rules, or lost linguistic systems beneath the surface of the text. In the modern era, computational tools and artificial intelligence have expanded the scope of analysis significantly, enabling the detection of highly detailed statistical regularities and structural consistencies, yet even these advanced methods have not succeeded in producing a coherent or widely accepted interpretation, suggesting that the manuscript does not conform to the assumptions underlying these analytical systems. The illustrations, which include detailed depictions of botanical forms, astronomical diagrams, and human figures engaged in unfamiliar activities, continue to play a central role in shaping interpretation, as they provide visual coherence without offering definitive reference points, creating a sense that the manuscript is internally structured but externally unanchored. This combination of textual regularity and visual ambiguity produces a unique interpretive environment in which meaning appears to emerge but never stabilizes, instead shifting continuously as new analytical perspectives are applied. As a result, researchers increasingly find themselves engaged not in a process of decoding a fixed message, but in navigating a field of fluctuating possibilities, where each interpretive step generates new questions rather than final answers. Some scholars have proposed that this behavior may indicate that the manuscript does not encode meaning in a traditional semantic sense, but instead organizes relationships, constraints, or procedural patterns that are not intended to be translated directly into language. From this perspective, the manuscript would function less as a text and more as a structured system of interactions, where meaning arises only through engagement rather than extraction, and where interpretation becomes an active process of alignment rather than translation. This idea challenges conventional assumptions in linguistics and information theory, particularly the belief that structured signals inherently correspond to recoverable meaning, suggesting instead that structure and meaning may operate independently under certain conditions. The application of computational analysis has further reinforced this possibility, as algorithmic models can identify complex patterns within the manuscript, yet these patterns do not converge into a stable semantic framework, indicating that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to establish meaning. This has led to a growing awareness that the challenge posed by the manuscript is not simply technical, but conceptual, requiring a rethinking of how meaning is defined, how it emerges, and under what conditions it can be said to exist. The Voynich Manuscript thus increasingly functions as a boundary object, revealing the limits of current interpretive systems while simultaneously exposing the assumptions that underpin them, particularly the expectation that structure must lead to understanding. In this sense, the manuscript does not merely resist interpretation, it alters the conditions under which interpretation takes place, causing meaning to drift between potential readings without settling into any single one. As research continues, the manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across its pages, yet its interpretive landscape remains in constant motion, shaped by the evolving frameworks brought to it. Ultimately, it serves as a reminder that meaning is not always a stable endpoint of analysis, but sometimes a shifting process that depends as much on the observer as on the object observed, and that understanding may not always arrive as resolution, but as an ongoing awareness of the instability inherent in interpretation itself. As the long-standing investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues to unfold, a subtle yet increasingly important realization begins to shape the way the manuscript is understood. Every attempt to interpret it seems to return, in some form, to the starting point, as if the process of analysis is not moving forward toward resolution but circulating within a self-referential loop where each conclusion reopens the same fundamental uncertainty. The text, with its carefully arranged yet undeciphered script, maintains an appearance of linguistic structure through repetition, distribution, and pattern consistency, but these features do not consolidate into any stable semantic framework, instead producing a persistent oscillation between apparent order and interpretive collapse. Over time, this has shifted the focus of inquiry from the expectation of decoding the manuscript to examining why decoding itself appears to generate repeating cycles of partial understanding that ultimately fail to converge. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its unknown origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfred Voynich, reflects this cyclical pattern, as each generation of researchers introduces new methodologies, ranging from symbolic interpretation and cryptographic decoding to statistical modeling and computational analysis, only to encounter the same unresolved structure that resists closure regardless of the tools applied. Early interpretations often framed the manuscript as a repository of hidden knowledge encoded in symbolic or esoteric form, while later approaches sought to treat it as a cipher or linguistic artifact, assuming that sufficient analytical precision would eventually reveal a stable underlying message. However, as more advanced techniques have been developed, including large-scale computational pattern recognition and artificial intelligence-based modeling, the manuscript has continued to defy resolution, revealing structure without yielding translation, and consistency without producing meaning. The illustrations, which include intricate depictions of botanical forms, astronomical configurations, and human figures engaged in enigmatic activities, contribute significantly to this interpretive loop, as they appear to offer contextual grounding for the text while simultaneously resisting clear identification, creating a situation in which visual and textual elements reinforce ambiguity rather than resolve it. This interplay between structure and uncertainty generates a unique interpretive condition in which each analytical step appears to move closer to understanding, yet ultimately circles back to the same unresolved ambiguity, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates within a closed system of interpretation that resists external anchoring. Some researchers have begun to propose that this behavior may indicate that the manuscript is not designed to encode a singular message, but rather to sustain a dynamic system of relationships in which meaning is not fixed but continuously generated through interaction between elements. From this perspective, the manuscript would not function as a traditional communicative artifact, but as a structured field of patterns that produces interpretive possibilities without resolving them into a final semantic form. This challenges conventional assumptions in linguistics, cryptography, and information theory, all of which generally presuppose that structured signals correspond to recoverable meaning, suggesting instead that structure and meaning may not always be aligned in predictable ways. The application of computational methods has further reinforced this observation, as algorithmic systems are able to detect increasingly complex regularities within the manuscript, yet these regularities do not converge into a stable interpretation, instead producing layered patterns that mirror linguistic behavior without confirming semantic content. This has led to a growing recognition that the challenge posed by the manuscript may not lie in its complexity alone, but in the recursive nature of interpretation itself, where each attempt to decode generates new patterns of understanding that ultimately reflect back on the interpretive framework rather than revealing the object of study. In this sense, the Voynich Manuscript functions as a conceptual loop, one in which analysis continually folds back into itself, exposing the assumptions embedded within each interpretive approach while simultaneously resisting closure. The historical persistence of this loop across centuries suggests that the manuscript may occupy a unique position within the study of language and meaning, serving not as a problem awaiting solution, but as a structure that continuously tests the boundaries of interpretive systems. As researchers continue to engage with it, the manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across its pages, yet its interpretive significance remains in motion, shaped by the evolving frameworks applied to it and the recursive nature of inquiry itself. Ultimately, it reveals that understanding is not always a linear path toward resolution, but sometimes a circular process in which each attempt to grasp meaning leads back to the recognition of its continued absence, transforming the pursuit of knowledge into an ongoing reflection on the limits and structure of interpretation itself. As the exploration of the Voynich manuscript reaches yet another layer of depth, something subtle but significant begins to emerge. The absence of translation no longer feels like a simple failure of understanding, but rather begins to appear as a structured condition in itself, as though silence within the manuscript is not empty but organized according to patterns that resist articulation. The text continues to present itself with remarkable internal consistency, displaying repeated sequences of symbols, rhythmic spacing, and carefully balanced distributions that strongly resemble linguistic behavior, yet these same features never stabilize into any known system of meaning, creating a state where structure is undeniably present but interpretation remains perpetually suspended. Over time, this has shifted the focus of inquiry away from the expectation that meaning must eventually be recovered, and toward a more unsettling question, whether the manuscript is not withholding meaning, but instead operating within a form of structured non-meaning that behaves like language without resolving into it. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its obscure creation in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this evolving tension, as each era approaches the text with increasing sophistication, only to encounter the same unresolved condition dressed in different analytical languages. Early interpretations often relied on symbolic or mystical frameworks, treating the manuscript as a vessel of hidden esoteric knowledge, while later approaches attempted to classify it as a cipher or lost language, assuming that sufficient methodological refinement would eventually reveal a stable underlying message. In the modern era, computational linguistics and artificial intelligence have introduced powerful tools capable of detecting subtle statistical regularities and structural dependencies, yet even these advanced systems have been unable to transform those patterns into coherent semantic interpretation, instead reinforcing the sense that the manuscript exists in a space where structure does not guarantee meaning. The illustrations, which include complex depictions of botanical forms, celestial arrangements, and human figures interacting with unfamiliar mechanisms, continue to contribute to this ambiguity, as they appear visually ordered and intentional while resisting firm identification within any known scientific, historical, or symbolic system. This creates a persistent interpretive tension in which the mind perceives coherence but cannot anchor it, resulting in a sustained awareness of structure without resolution. In response to this condition, some researchers have proposed that the manuscript may not function as a communicative artifact in the traditional sense, but rather as a system that generates organized patterns without encoding fixed semantic content, suggesting that what appears to be language may in fact be a self-contained structural process. From this perspective, meaning is not something hidden within the manuscript waiting to be uncovered, but something that fails to stabilize because the system itself does not operate according to the principles required for stable interpretation. This challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics and information theory, particularly the idea that structured signals inherently correspond to recoverable meaning, and instead suggests that structure and meaning may be separable under certain conditions. The application of computational analysis has reinforced this possibility, as algorithmic models consistently identify non-random organization within the text, yet these findings do not converge into a consistent translation, indicating that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to bridge the gap between formal structure and semantic interpretation. As a result, the manuscript increasingly functions as a conceptual boundary case, revealing not only the limits of current interpretive frameworks but also the assumptions that define those frameworks, particularly the expectation that meaning must emerge from structure in a predictable and recoverable way. In this sense, the Voynich manuscript does not simply resist interpretation, it reframes the conditions under which interpretation occurs, exposing the possibility that some systems may sustain structured form without ever resolving into accessible meaning. This realization has gradually shifted the focus of research from decoding the manuscript to understanding the nature of decoding itself, transforming the manuscript into a reflective surface through which the mechanics of interpretation can be observed. As the investigation continues, the manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across centuries of scrutiny, yet its conceptual presence continues to expand, shaped by the evolving frameworks applied to it and the growing awareness that not all structured systems necessarily yield to understanding. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that silence within a system may not signify absence, but may instead represent a form of organization that exists outside the boundaries of interpretation, challenging the assumption that meaning is always the final destination of analysis, and suggesting instead that some forms of structure may remain perpetually unresolved, not because they are hidden, but because they do not align with the conditions under which meaning becomes stable. As the study of the Voynich manuscript continues to progress through decades of scrutiny and evolving analytical methods, a more unsettling realization begins to emerge, one that does not concern the difficulty of decoding the manuscript, but rather the possibility that what is being observed does not behave like meaning in any conventional sense, even though it strongly resembles it from a structural perspective. The text continues to exhibit a level of internal consistency that is difficult to dismiss, with recurring symbol patterns, balanced distributions, and rhythmic arrangements that closely mirror the statistical behavior of known languages, yet these features never consolidate into a stable interpretive framework, creating a condition in which the appearance of language is undeniable while its semantic function remains permanently inaccessible. Over time, this has led researchers to reconsider the very assumptions that define what it means for something to be interpretable, as the manuscript repeatedly demonstrates that structure alone does not guarantee comprehension, and that organized complexity can exist without yielding communicable content. The historical path of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this ongoing tension, as each period of study introduces new interpretive frameworks, ranging from symbolic and mystical readings to cryptographic and linguistic models, and more recently computational and machine learning approaches. Yet none of these frameworks has succeeded in producing a universally accepted translation. Early interpretations often assumed that the manuscript concealed hidden knowledge encoded in symbolic or allegorical form, suggesting that its strangeness was a veil over meaningful content, while later approaches treated it as a cipher or lost language, operating under the assumption that sufficient analytical precision would eventually reveal a recoverable message. However, as analytical techniques have become more sophisticated, incorporating large-scale statistical modeling and artificial intelligence, the manuscript has continued to resist resolution, revealing patterns that suggest linguistic structure without producing semantic clarity. The illustrations, which include detailed depictions of botanical forms, astronomical diagrams, and human figures engaged in unfamiliar and sometimes ambiguous activities, further complicate interpretation, as they present visually coherent systems that do not correspond clearly to any known scientific, historical, or cultural framework, thereby reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates within an internally consistent but externally unreferenced system. This combination of textual regularity and visual ambiguity creates a persistent interpretive paradox, in which the mind recognizes order but cannot confirm its meaning, resulting in a continuous oscillation between perceived structure and unresolved uncertainty. In response to this paradox, some researchers have begun to explore the possibility that the manuscript does not encode meaning in the traditional sense at all, but instead functions as a generative system of structured relationships, where the arrangement of symbols and images produces the appearance of language without committing to fixed semantic content. From this perspective, meaning is not something hidden within the manuscript waiting to be extracted, but something that fails to stabilize because the system itself may not be designed to support stable interpretation. This challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics and information theory, particularly the belief that structured signals inherently correspond to recoverable meaning, and instead suggests that structure and meaning may operate independently under certain conditions. The application of computational analysis has reinforced this perspective, as algorithmic models consistently identify non-random organization within the manuscript, yet these findings do not converge into a coherent translation, indicating that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to bridge the gap between formal structure and semantic understanding. As a result, the manuscript increasingly functions as a boundary case in the study of language and interpretation, revealing not only the limitations of current methodologies but also the assumptions that underlie them, especially the expectation that meaning must emerge from structure in a predictable and recoverable manner. This has gradually shifted the focus of research from the goal of decoding the manuscript to a broader inquiry into the conditions under which meaning itself becomes possible, transforming the manuscript into a conceptual tool for examining the relationship between structure, interpretation, and comprehension. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript does not simply represent an unsolved puzzle, but rather a persistent challenge to the frameworks through which puzzles are defined and solved, suggesting that some systems may exist in a state where organized form does not necessarily lead to interpretive closure. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across centuries of examination, yet its conceptual significance continues to evolve, shaped by the shifting interpretive lenses applied to it and the growing recognition that meaning may not always behave as a stable endpoint of analysis. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that structured complexity does not always resolve into understanding, and that the boundaries of meaning may be more fluid, conditional, and context-dependent than traditionally assumed, leaving open the possibility that some forms of order are not meant to be decoded, but to be encountered as enduring expressions of unresolved structure. As the long and increasingly layered investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues, a quieter and more unsettling phase of understanding begins to emerge, one that is not marked by dramatic breakthroughs or sudden clarity, but by a gradual recognition that every attempt at explanation seems to carry within it the seeds of its own incompleteness. The manuscript continues to present itself as a highly organized system of symbols, with consistent repetition, structured spacing, and statistically balanced patterns that strongly resemble the behavior of natural language, yet these same features resist any stable alignment with known linguistic, cryptographic, or symbolic frameworks, creating a persistent condition where explanation appears possible in principle but impossible in practice. Over time, this has led researchers to notice that failure is not random or chaotic, but strangely consistent in its form, as though every interpretive approach eventually converges toward the same point of breakdown, regardless of the starting assumptions or methodological tools used. The historical journey of the manuscript, from its obscure creation in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this pattern of repeated engagement and repeated collapse, as each generation of scholars brings new intellectual frameworks to the text, only to encounter the same unresolved structure beneath changing analytical languages. Early interpretations often assumed that the manuscript must conceal meaningful content encoded in symbolic, mystical, or allegorical form, suggesting that its strangeness was a veil covering hidden knowledge, while later approaches shifted toward more systematic attempts at decoding, treating the manuscript as a cipher or lost language that could be recovered through careful analysis. However, even with the development of increasingly sophisticated methods, including statistical modeling, computational linguistics, and machine learning, the manuscript has continued to resist translation, revealing structured regularities without yielding semantic stability, and thereby challenging the assumption that structure and meaning are inherently linked. The illustrations, which depict complex arrangements of plants, astronomical forms, and human figures engaged in unfamiliar activities, further deepen this ambiguity, as they present visually coherent systems that do not correspond clearly to any known scientific, historical, or cultural reference points, creating a parallel layer of organization that mirrors the textual structure without clarifying it. This dual presence of structured text and structured imagery produces a unique interpretive environment in which meaning seems perpetually imminent but never fully realized, as if the system is constantly approaching explanation without ever crossing into it. In response to this condition, some researchers have begun to suggest that the manuscript may not function as a traditional communicative artifact at all, but rather as a system that generates organized complexity without encoding fixed semantic content, effectively producing the appearance of language without committing to its interpretability in conventional terms. From this perspective, meaning is not hidden within the manuscript waiting to be uncovered, but is instead absent in a way that is structurally consistent, meaning that the system may operate according to principles that do not prioritize semantic resolution. This idea challenges long-standing assumptions in linguistics and information theory, which typically presume that structured signals are designed to carry recoverable meaning, suggesting instead that there may exist forms of organization in which structure and meaning are decoupled. The application of computational analysis has reinforced this possibility, as algorithms consistently detect non-random patterns within the manuscript, yet these patterns fail to converge into a coherent translation, indicating that the presence of structure alone is insufficient to guarantee interpretability. As a result, the manuscript increasingly appears not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition that exposes the limits of problem-solving frameworks themselves, revealing how deeply the expectation of resolution is embedded within interpretive practices. This has gradually shifted the focus of research from the pursuit of decoding toward a more reflective inquiry into the nature of interpretation, meaning, and understanding, where the manuscript functions as a test case for the boundaries of analytical systems. In this evolving context, the Voynich manuscript does not simply resist explanation, it reveals how explanation itself is constructed, how it depends on alignment between system and framework, and how it can quietly fail without producing clear signs of collapse. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its pages fixed and its symbols unaltered, yet its conceptual presence continues to expand as each interpretive attempt adds new layers of reflection, demonstrating that the process of understanding is not only about reaching conclusions, but also about recognizing the conditions under which conclusions fail to form. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that explanation is not an automatic consequence of structure, and that some systems may sustain organized complexity without ever yielding to interpretive closure, leaving meaning not absent, but perpetually unresolved in a way that quietly reshapes the very idea of what it means to understand. As the long and increasingly intricate investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues, a subtle but decisive shift begins to appear in the nature of interpretation itself, where the central problem is no longer how to decode the manuscript, but why every attempt to assign stable meaning seems to dissolve before it can fully take shape. The text continues to present an appearance of linguistic order, with recurring symbols, consistent spacing patterns, and structured sequences that strongly resemble grammatical organization, yet these features never resolve into any recognizable language, creating a condition in which form is undeniably present while meaning remains perpetually out of reach. Over time, this has led researchers to recognize that the manuscript does not behave like a conventional encrypted message or lost language awaiting recovery, but rather like a system that continuously generates the impression of meaning without allowing that meaning to settle into a fixed interpretation. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this enduring instability, as each generation of scholars approaches it with new intellectual tools and theoretical frameworks, only to encounter the same unresolved tension between structure and interpretation. Early attempts to understand the manuscript often relied on symbolic, mystical, or allegorical readings, treating its strangeness as evidence of hidden knowledge encoded in obscure form, while later approaches shifted toward more systematic methods grounded in cryptography, linguistics, and statistical analysis, assuming that sufficient analytical precision would eventually reveal a stable underlying message. In the modern era, computational linguistics and artificial intelligence have expanded the scope of analysis significantly, allowing researchers to identify complex statistical regularities and structural patterns within the text, yet even these advanced techniques have not succeeded in producing a coherent translation, instead reinforcing the sense that structure alone does not guarantee semantic accessibility. The illustrations, which include detailed depictions of botanical forms, astronomical diagrams, and human figures engaged in unfamiliar and often ambiguous activities, continue to complicate interpretation, as they appear internally consistent while resisting clear external reference, thereby reinforcing the impression that the manuscript operates within a self-contained system of organization that does not map directly onto known frameworks of knowledge. This combination of textual regularity and visual ambiguity produces a unique interpretive environment in which meaning seems continuously suggested but never fully established, creating a persistent state of interpretive suspension where every hypothesis remains provisional and every conclusion unstable. In response to this condition, some researchers have proposed that the manuscript may not encode meaning in the traditional sense at all, but instead function as a system of structured relations that generates patterns without committing to fixed semantic content, effectively producing a form of organized complexity that resembles language without behaving as language in the conventional sense. From this perspective, meaning is not something hidden within the manuscript waiting to be discovered, but something that fails to emerge because the system itself may not be designed to support stable semantic interpretation. This challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics and information theory, particularly the belief that structured signals inherently correspond to recoverable meaning, suggesting instead that structure and meaning may be separable under certain conditions. The application of computational analysis has further reinforced this idea, as algorithmic models consistently detect non-random organization within the manuscript, yet these findings do not converge into a stable interpretive framework, indicating that pattern recognition alone is insufficient to establish meaning. As a result, the manuscript increasingly functions as a boundary case in the study of language and interpretation, exposing the limits of current methodologies while simultaneously revealing the assumptions that underlie them, particularly the expectation that structure must ultimately lead to semantic resolution. This has gradually shifted the focus of research away from the goal of decoding toward a more reflective examination of interpretation itself, where the manuscript becomes a means of exploring how meaning is constructed, stabilized, and sometimes prevented from forming. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript does not simply resist interpretation, it actively reshapes the conditions under which interpretation occurs, revealing that meaning is not always a stable endpoint of analysis, but sometimes a fragile outcome that depends on precise alignment between system and framework. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across centuries of examination, yet its conceptual presence continues to expand as each interpretive attempt adds new layers of uncertainty and reflection. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that meaning does not always settle into place, that structured systems do not always yield to explanation, and that understanding may sometimes consist not in reaching definitive answers, but in recognizing the persistent instability that lies at the heart of interpretation itself. As the investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues to progress into increasingly refined layers of analysis, a more subtle and philosophically unsettling realization begins to take shape. The manuscript does not merely resist interpretation, but appears to exist in a condition where the very act of interpretation consistently fails to align with the structure being observed, as if two systems, one of analysis and one of expression, are permanently misaligned despite repeated attempts to synchronize them. The text itself maintains an extraordinary level of internal consistency, with repeating symbol clusters, balanced distributions, and orderly patterns that strongly resemble the statistical behavior of natural language, yet these same features refuse to stabilize into any recognizable linguistic system, creating a persistent divide between formal structure and semantic accessibility. Over time, this has led researchers to reconsider not only the manuscript, but the assumptions embedded within their methods, as each analytical framework, whether linguistic, cryptographic, statistical, or computational, appears to generate meaningful intermediate results that ultimately fail to converge into a unified explanation. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its obscure origins in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfrid Voynich, reflects this recurring misalignment, as each generation approaches the text with increasingly sophisticated tools and theoretical models, only to encounter the same unresolved gap between pattern and meaning. Early interpretations often assumed that the manuscript must conceal a coherent message encoded through symbolic or allegorical systems, suggesting that its strangeness was a surface layer hiding structured knowledge beneath, while later approaches attempted to treat it as a cipher or linguistic relic, operating under the assumption that sufficient analytical precision would eventually resolve the underlying code. However, even as methodologies have evolved into highly advanced computational systems capable of detecting subtle statistical regularities and structural dependencies, the manuscript has continued to resist resolution, revealing organization without interpretation, and structure without semantic anchoring. The illustrations, which include intricate depictions of plants that do not correspond clearly to known species, astronomical diagrams that resist conventional classification, and human figures engaged in ambiguous and sometimes ritual-like activities, further intensify this interpretive misalignment, as they appear internally coherent yet externally unreferenced, suggesting a visual system that is structured but not anchored in identifiable reality. This dual condition, where both text and image exhibit order without yielding stable meaning, creates an interpretive environment in which analysis repeatedly produces partial coherence that collapses upon closer integration, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript is not simply difficult to decode, but fundamentally resistant to alignment with interpretive systems designed to understand it. In response to this persistent misalignment, some researchers have proposed that the manuscript may not encode meaning in the conventional sense at all, but instead operate as a system of relational patterns whose purpose is not to transmit information but to generate structured complexity without semantic commitment. From this perspective, meaning is not hidden within the manuscript waiting to be extracted, but absent in a structural sense, because the system itself may not be organized around the principle of communicative intent as understood in known linguistic systems. This challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics, semiotics, and information theory, particularly the belief that structured signals are inherently designed for interpretation and that decoding is a matter of identifying the correct mapping between system and meaning. The application of computational analysis has reinforced this challenge, as algorithmic models consistently identify statistically significant organization within the manuscript, yet these findings do not converge into a stable interpretive framework, suggesting that structural regularity alone is insufficient to guarantee semantic alignment. As a result, the manuscript increasingly appears not as a problem awaiting solution, but as a structural anomaly that exposes the limitations of interpretive alignment itself, revealing that the relationship between pattern and meaning may depend on conditions that are not satisfied in this case. This has gradually shifted the focus of inquiry from the pursuit of decoding toward a broader examination of interpretive systems themselves, where the manuscript functions as a test case for understanding how meaning is constructed, stabilized, or prevented from forming. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript does not simply resist explanation, it reveals the fragile conditions under which explanation becomes possible, highlighting the dependence of meaning on compatibility between system and interpreter. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its pages fixed and its symbols unaltered across centuries of study, yet its conceptual presence continues to expand as each interpretive attempt adds new dimensions of uncertainty, reinforcing the idea that understanding is not solely a property of the object being studied, but also a reflection of the frameworks used to study it. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that when systems fail to align, meaning does not simply remain hidden, it may never fully form at all, leaving interpretation suspended in a space where structure persists, but resolution does not arrive. As the long investigation into the Voynich manuscript continues to unfold, a subtle but profound reversal begins to take shape in the nature of the inquiry, where the manuscript is no longer merely the object being studied, but increasingly becomes the force that reshapes the very methods, assumptions, and expectations of those who attempt to understand it. The text, with its carefully structured yet undeciphered script, continues to present an appearance of linguistic order through repetition, distribution, and consistent symbol formation, yet these features remain resistant to any stable mapping onto known languages or symbolic systems, creating a condition in which analysis produces structure but never resolution. Over time, this persistent failure to converge on meaning has gradually shifted attention away from the question of what the manuscript says, toward the deeper and more complex question of what it does to the act of interpretation itself. The historical trajectory of the manuscript, from its uncertain origin in the 15th century to its modern rediscovery by Wilfred Voynich, reflects this evolving dynamic, as each generation of researchers approaches the text with new tools, theories, and intellectual frameworks, only to find that the manuscript consistently resists integration into any single explanatory model. Early interpretations often assumed that the manuscript must conceal a coherent message encoded in symbolic, mystical, or allegorical form, suggesting that its strangeness was a surface layer masking hidden knowledge, while later approaches attempted to classify it as a cipher or lost language, operating under the belief that sufficient analytical precision would eventually reveal a recoverable structure beneath the surface. However, as methodologies have become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating statistical modeling, computational linguistics, and artificial intelligence, the manuscript has continued to defy resolution, revealing patterns that resemble language without producing semantic clarity, and structure without interpretive closure. The illustrations, which include detailed depictions of botanical forms that do not correspond clearly to known species, astronomical diagrams that resist conventional classification, and human figures engaged in ambiguous, often circular arrangements, further complicate this dynamic, as they appear visually coherent while remaining externally unanchored, reinforcing the sense that the manuscript operates within a self-contained system of organization that does not align with external reference frameworks. This combination of textual regularity and visual ambiguity produces a unique interpretive condition in which meaning appears continuously immanent but never fully actualized, as though the system is perpetually on the verge of becoming understandable without ever crossing that threshold. In response to this persistent condition, some researchers have begun to propose that the manuscript may not function as a communicative artifact in the traditional sense at all, but instead operates as a system that generates structured complexity without encoding stable semantic content, effectively producing the appearance of language without fulfilling its interpretive function. From this perspective, meaning is not hidden within the manuscript waiting to be uncovered, but absent in a structural sense, because the system itself may not be organized around the principles required for semantic stability. This challenges foundational assumptions in linguistics, cryptography, and information theory, particularly the idea that structured signals are inherently designed to be decoded, and that interpretation is a matter of recovering an intended message. The application of computational analysis has reinforced this challenge, as algorithmic systems consistently detect non-random organization within the manuscript, yet these findings do not converge into a coherent or stable translation, suggesting that pattern recognition alone cannot bridge the gap between structure and meaning. As a result, the manuscript increasingly functions as a conceptual boundary case, exposing the limits of interpretive systems while simultaneously revealing the assumptions embedded within them, especially the expectation that structure must ultimately lead to semantic resolution. This has gradually transformed the focus of research from the goal of decoding the manuscript to a broader reflection on the nature of interpretation itself, where the manuscript becomes a tool for examining how meaning is constructed, stabilized, and sometimes fundamentally prevented from forming. In this evolving context, the Voynich Manuscript does not simply resist explanation, it redirects the inquiry, turning the search for meaning into an exploration of the conditions under which meaning becomes possible or fails to emerge. The manuscript remains physically unchanged, its symbols and illustrations fixed across centuries of examination, yet its conceptual significance continues to expand, shaped by the shifting frameworks applied to it and the growing recognition that the act of interpretation is not merely about discovering what is contained within a system, but about understanding the limits and structures of the systems we use to interpret. Ultimately, it stands as a reminder that the search for meaning can become its own subject, and that in some cases, the most significant discovery is not what a system contains, but how persistently it reshapes the very process of seeking understanding itself.